Well, that was a great presentation. I was glad to be able to sit in on that one. It's fantastic to see people getting these kind of results using DDMRP, which we see time and time again. So just by way of introduction, I am Brad Mitchler. I am the Vice President of Product at Demand-Driven Technologies, which of course is a software company that really supports the methodology of DDMRP that we're talking about today. And I'm so grateful and honored to be a part of this event, this great event for Eastern Europe. Really awesome to have so many people interested in learning about DDMRP today. So today, we're going to talk about something that is a little bit different in the space of DDMRP. One of the great things about this methodology is the simplicity and the easy math of the buffers and the techniques that we use to gain performance in our supply chains. And for the better part of about a year or 18 months, we have been really studying very deeply the data behind DDMRP and the data behind demand variation specifically in our clients' environments to understand if there's a better way to buffer and define the settings for DDMRP managed items. In fact, I think there was just a question on the UCO presentation about where do we find the settings, the right settings for different item categories in our client environment for UCO there. And the reality is that we have some very easy, but in some ways limiting ways to find and apply the right settings. And instead we rely heavily on really, really smart people and analysis, from Seattle's Law and the ABM team and et cetera, in order to apply those right settings. And what we're doing with AI/ML is we're hoping to find a more automated and easy way to take these settings and apply them to buffers. So I'm first going to talk about how we can leverage machine learning to improve the DDMRP user experience. And then we're really going to dig in just at a high level in terms of what the value proposition of DDMRP and machine learning is. So today, I will recap this, but I think hopefully throughout the conference here, we've seen over and over, time and time again through our clients and other clients around the world, that DDMRP is delivering really tangible results for people in many different industries, regions, etc. And this comes to us in terms of, improved service levels first and foremost, right? Maintaining or improving service levels, the absolute key of this DDMRP methodology. We see reductions in working capital. UCO just talked about having less inventory on the parts that are not moving, right? So eliminating some of that excess inventory, aligning inventory to actual demand. This is a very natural result of applying the methodology. And then compressed lead times and ultimately responsiveness to the market. Where can it still be improved, right? If I look at inventory turnover rates over the last 25 years, this is for the US, but I think the trend is global in nature. In the main 25 years of ERP, big ERP implementations, we've seen that inventory turnover rates have remained relatively flat, right, across the globe. So we're implementing big software and ERP and everything else, and we're really not moving the needle in terms of how we manage our inventory. And that's because we use forecasts to plan inventory, and we rely on Excel and analysis and mashing together supply and demand. And there's a better way to plan, as we've seen. Using demand-driven MRP, we see a much faster time to value a much quicker way to align inventory to actual demand. This is an example from just one of our mini clients who's able to reduce inventory and get great results by using this very simple system in a short amount of time. That said, DDMRP can still be improved in the way that we adopt and implement and maintain the system. So we're getting great results based on a more reliable demand signal, right? We're using actual consumption instead of forecast. This is very critical. We have better visibility to the items that we should be ordering. We have better visibility to items that we're actually over ordering and we should order less of. We have a great way to benchmark and evaluate planning over time. We use the alerts that are described in the DDMRP education to monitor open supply and make sure that we have the right timing of supply and demand. And ultimately, roughly right is better than precisely wrong. So this is a pragmatic and practical way to manage inventory. We're not perfect, right? But we're planning in ranges, and this gives us a really positive result. Where we can continue to improve methodology is in the adoption, implementation, and maintenance of the operating model. So today, the implementations for DDMRP are really quite easy, fast time to value, etc. But again, there's a lot of guesswork in establishing the buffer profile settings. It requires heavy consulting, a lot of data analysis to really hone in and group items properly to make sure we have good settings. What we would like to do is improve the alignment of items into appropriate settings groups. And that means effectively supporting different lead time ranges, right? Different buckets of lead time have different appropriate settings. And most paramountly, it's about improving the management of variation. So first of all, what is variation? How can I judge variation and then apply the right red zone settings specifically to items with different variability signatures, what we say signatures. We'd like to be able to improve the detection of changes. So we have this concept of drift in the data, which means that over time, items change, right? Variability on the first day of the year may be very different than variability on the last day of the year because our markets are changing, right? Our products are changing. The economy is changing across the globe constantly. So there's this idea of drift, and the system should be able to recognize drift and apply changes appropriately to help alleviate some of the maintenance that must go on in order to keep the system healthy. And then, very clearly as well, this was also a question that was asked in the UCO presentation. How do we identify which items should be used for DDMRP versus those that should be non-buffered or used as a min-max or have a static reorder point? Okay. Our ultimate goal from a product standpoint in thinking about how to change the methodology of DDMRP is to have trust in the system such that the planners can oversee and maintain the health of the system without getting into the detail of every single item to tweak the settings themselves, right? If we look at, I've got two examples here, but if we look at space travel over the last 50 years, it has increased dramatically in the automation and the way that we travel to space. Just 2 weeks ago, here in the US, we had 4 civilians go to space. These are not astronauts. They don't know how to fly spacecraft. And the simplicity of using this machine and doing something incredibly complex has increased dramatically thanks to machine learning, AI, and ultimately technology. Same thing with driving cars, right? Now we're starting to see cars that have the ability to drive themselves. And there's all this complex motion going on, lane changing, avoiding civilians, etc. All of this is happening automatically. And in these two cases, there are human lives at stake, right? So it's a very dangerous situation. We absolutely must be right, and we're still letting the system work itself. But in supply chain, if I look at the way that people manage supply chain, we're still having a very hands-on, human-based, nervous approach to planning material. And it really doesn't make any sense. Lives are not at stake, at least to the same degree in supply chain planning, yet we don't appear to be headed towards the same level of automation or trust in the system that we otherwise are in some of these other technologies. So part of the problem here is that if I look at the typical way that we assign buffer profiles or item settings in DDMRP, we kind of use a matrix around lead time versus variability, okay? And we group like items together and apply those settings to items. And what the result of that is a big matrix of different item settings that we must maintain, keep track of, and move items around over time to make sure that they always have the correct settings. We do this specifically on the variability side using what's called the coefficient of variance, or COV. And the COV is a good, but in some ways, a measure of variability that falls short. It's simply the standard deviation of demand, usually over 1 year, divided by the average of demand over that same year. And this gives us a relative measure of variation. We take this and it helps us define what should be the red zone settings or the variability protection in our buffer. What we've seen over thousands and thousands of items and simulations and client databases is that COV can be very limited because it doesn't take into account the timing or grouping of demand. In this case, I have two parts, one that has quite regular demand here at the top. And you can see I've got some spikes, but really regular demand throughout the year. And it gives me a COV, or coefficient of variance, of 252%. Another item that has a much different demand pattern in the way that demands are grouped together at one time throughout the year, it results in the same COV. And I think clearly these two items, they behave differently. And you can see they're getting different results in terms of inventory turns in the way that the buffers are applied to these. So the reality is, right now, using COV, these look very similar, but they actually deserve settings that are quite different from each other in terms of variation protection. So what we're doing and where all of our research and development has been focused on is using pattern recognition to understand demand better so that we can better group demand in a way other than using COV. If we think about a sound wave or a song, right, there's this idea of Shazam, and this is not new technology, right? Shazam is a paradigm that's been out for, 10 years. And what this does is, if there's a song playing and I'm in a restaurant, I can pull out my phone and immediately the phone will record the sound wave that the music is making and project or tell you what album, what artist, and what song you're listening to is. And if we think about demand is a lot like a sound wave, right? We have variability in the impact of demand over time, and we should be able to take that, record it, and then align it to other demand patterns that are similar in nature. And that's what we're doing, using what we call clustering of demand signals in DDMRP. here you can see 189 parts in my machine learning tool fell into the same cluster. So this is a representative demand pattern that is not exactly the same for all 189 parts, but 189 parts have similar variation of demand and can be assigned into the same cluster. Okay, and this is very critical. In most businesses, certainly there are different segments of parts that are going to behave similarly based on variation of demand, seasonality, promotionability, etc. And that's really what we aim to discover, is what groups of parts make sense to assign together. At the bottom, you can see on a coefficient of variability basis that even though all these parts fall in the same cluster, they have different COVs across the board. A lot of parts have very low COV, but I've even got some parts that fit in the same demand pattern that have very high COVs. So it goes to show that COV is not the best predictor of variability. What we're doing with these is we're taking we're taking the cluster, we're simulating now based on the represented demand pattern for the cluster to come up with the best red zone settings for these parts in a different way. What we've seen over our research is that we can reliably come up with a better red zone sizing mechanism than COV using this machine learning pattern recognition. And we're seeing time and time again that the results of running the data through this tool set is outpacing that of our traditional method. And ultimately, this is going to result in the maintaining or improvement of service levels, of desired service levels that a client has, while getting more parts in the right settings group, which will result in less inventory, less working capital, and overall just an easier way to maintain the optimal buffer settings without having a human run through over and over on a regularly scheduled basis to assign the proper settings to the proper parts. And so this is the first place that we're applying machine learning and artificial intelligence into DDMRP. With that, I think I'm just up on time, so I'm gonna pause there and take questions.
Yeah, Brett, I have one question for me.
Sure.
So I'm gonna ask it on Russian and on English as well. So first in Russian. Как я задаю вопрос Брэду, интересно, может ли искусственный интеллект не только определять паттерны и управлять профилями буферов, да, но и делать какие-то советы или даже настраивать саму операционную модель, то, о чем говорил Бернард, где есть не только буферы запаса, но и мощности, буферы времени, то есть полностью модель производственной среды. Okay, Brett, so the same question just in English. So I was curious, obviously that artificial intelligence basically can define patterns and make suggestions about the red zone and the buffer profiles. But the question is, how do you see the future development of it? Could you see that probably in future it could also implement or just develop the demand-driven operating model? When you have the time buffers, capacity buffers, inventory buffers, will be also, I know, some best practice.
Yeah, thanks, Jaslav. So that's absolutely where we want to go, right? Because if I go back to the example of the SpaceX Dragon rocket or the Tesla auto-driving car, it's not just one thing that we have to tackle in order to drive towards this paradigm. Variation, we felt like, is the first place we needed to tackle so that we get the right settings on the right parts. But if you think about S&OP, which I think Bernard talked about, and adapting the operating model to the ever-changing market environment, it's critical that we do other things like drift detection, recommended adjustments to buffers and settings. All of this stuff can be encompassed in machine learning techniques and really help the users and the consultants maintain, implement, configure the system and the operating model in an easier way and a more sustainable way for the long term for our clients. Absolutely.
Yeah, thank you.